In our last episode, we talked about the ancient family and we made it universal, but we focused in on Israel because Israel follows the pattern of most ancient civilizations, and we also tried to explain how the ancient family functioned. Well, this is kind of the middle of the story. We don't really talk about exactly how the family started, especially as it relates to Africa. So in this episode, what we're going to do is to talk about the beginning of the family as it relates to African culture. Now, remember, our focal point is really Moses. Why? Because Moses writes the first 5 books of the Bible. Because the first 5 books are written by Moses, and because Moses was educated in Egypt, and because much of his understanding of the world was through Egyptian eyes, he becomes the central figure that we need to focus on. Now, the objective of this channel was to say this: when Moses sits down to write the book of Genesis, or all the 5 books, what does he know? And this is the question that we need to continue to ask and focus on. Now, we tend to believe that Egypt is the oldest, but it's not. It's actually Ethiopia. But Ethiopia is not the oldest either. The oldest civilization in Africa is actually located in what is the present day Sahara Desert. But Sahara Desert was not always a desert. In fact, there were times when the Sahara Desert was green. It had rivers, waterfalls, lakes, green savanna, and there was a flourishing amount of people and animals that lived in what you know today as the Sahara Desert. We know this from mainly rock art. We can look at the rocks in the Sahara and we can see how people carved out and painted different people at the time. And so we see pictures of cattle, we see pictures of people, we see pictures of animals, and many of these animals are very, very interesting because we also have things like giraffes, elephants, antelope, and cats. I mean, we see the gamut of animals in the Sahara, mainly because it is green, it is lush, it is fertile, and there is a lot of life in the Sahara. But then the axis of the earth tilted, and that had the effect of focusing the sun's heat on that area of the world, and that's why it became a desert. That can get very technical in explaining that, but that's the bottom line. Here is a picture of a crocodile. So we know that not only were there animals, but we know that there were animals that lived in the rivers and lakes and things like that. Now, with that in mind, let's talk about what the people were doing. Around 7600 BC, we actually find the remains of an astrological observatory. This laboratory for looking at stars, we identified as Nabta Playa, and it's important to understand that because it is a rock formation, we have been able to map out what they were looking at. And we know that they correctly identified the star Sirius. Sirius will become the most important star in African history in general. Next, we're going to see something very, very interesting, and we have to explain this in detail. We found a mummy in the Sahara. Now, this is interesting because we usually associate mummification with ancient Egypt, but that's simply not the case. mummification existed before Egypt, because what we're talking about, the Sahara, is hundreds of years before Egypt begins. So the mummy that we found is very, very interesting. The name of the mummy is Juan Mahuja. He's found in the Fezzan of the Sahara, which is close to Libya in present day. It was found, and carbon dating confirms that it died about 5600 BC. It's a young boy. He seems to be about 2 years of age. Now, this is the important part. This young boy, his internal organs were surgically removed, and a substance was placed inside the body to keep it from decaying. This is the actual textbook way that you made a mummy. And the Egyptians will adopt this same technique. Then after the young boy's organs were removed, they wrapped the boy in animal skin. The wrapping of the child is something similar that we will see in ancient Egypt as well. He also had beads on, so we associate this with culture. This mummy presents us with an incredible amount of information about the sophistication and the life of the people living in the Sahara. Now, in order for somebody to mummify someone, this would indicate a belief in the afterlife. The more we look at this, the more we find out that African culture was already existing long before Ethiopia and long before Egypt. Now, the man who has studied extensively on the rock art of the Sahara is Dr. Savino di Lervena. He's at the University of Rome in Italy, and he has carried out a number of excavations in the Sahara Desert, and he has found an amazing amount of information and data that we can analyze and understand what African people were doing at that time. One of the things that Savina has uncovered is the importance of cattle in Saharan culture. Cattle is not only important, but it seems to have been the central figure in the understanding of Saharan culture. We date it to around the same time of Juan Mahuja, the mummy. So cattle is going to be something that we need to focus on and understand. On the Masad Plains in the Sahara, in what is present-day Libya, we find the remains of ritual cults involving the cattle. We find a place where they actually sacrificed cattle in order to pray for rain. We have identified figures of cattle in the area and rock formations that they used in order to identify the area. We also find an enclosure, the place where they actually slaughtered the animals in order to prepare them for the sacrifice. Also, we find pottery, shards of pottery and cow bones, indicating that not only did they sacrifice the cattle, but they actually sat down and had a feast together in celebration perhaps, or recognition of this particular aspect of their spiritual beliefs. This is very interesting because cattle, or the cow, becomes very, very important in ancient Egypt. This is something that the Egyptians actually adopted from the Saharian culture. Let me put it another way. Egypt is not some isolated pop in out of nowhere kind of a civilization. Egypt is the culmination of the African cultures that existed before it. And Egypt brings together much of the African culture that was in the Sahara and in Ethiopia. So Egypt is a result, not the cause, a result of what African culture had achieved up until that point. The Apis bull is what it will become known in Egypt. And that bull is associated with Osiris. Osiris will be a figure that we will need to go into in great detail. He is the neter, or principle of God, that represents resurrection. Here you see a picture of a priest who is offering a cow. Now, it is very specific. The way a cow was sacrificed was that his hindquarters was severed and then offered. Now, this is very, very similar in concept to what the Israelites will eventually do. Now, they didn't have this kind of a sacrifice in any other parts of the world. So Israel's conceptualization of the idea of sacrifice is actually fundamentally, foundationally, an Egyptian concept. Interestingly enough, Dr. Servina discovered also on one of the rocks, as you're seeing the picture here, of a man in a dog mask. This is very, very interesting because, as you can see, the figure is a dog, and that dog will eventually become very important in ancient Egyptian civilization. Ancient Egyptian civilization's dog was Anubis, and Anubis represented the principle of death. We will eventually get into how the Egyptians saw death, but it is very, very different from our Western view. The concept of life and death is going to be something that is very, very different, and it will take some effort to understand. Now, the African people of the Sahara migrated to the Nile Valley. When they migrated to the Nile Valley, they settled in what is present-day Sudan. And so there are all sorts of names for the civilization that arose there. It is called Nubia, from the Egyptian word nub, which means gold. It is called Ethiopia. That is the Greek word. That's not a word that that the African people themselves use. The word Ethiopia means burnt face. They also call them Cushites. That is an Egyptian word that the Bible adopts. Or let me say it another way. It's a word that Moses adopts when he writes the first 5 books of the Bible. So the Ethiopians are Cushites, but let's make no mistake about it, as we're going to see, that the Egyptians are technically what you would call Cushites, because Egypt originated in Ethiopia. So as you can see, much of the migrations that you see in from the Sahara will end up in what you would call Sudan today. Now, once we get into the Sudan, we find the Kingdom of Ta-Seti. This is near the present-day city of Aswan. And here we find the Kingdom of Ta-Seti. It's dated to 3400 BC. It is identified in archaeological records as Cemetery L. In this cemetery, we find 33 tombs. We find 33 tombs. Inside those tombs are 18 kings, what you might call pharaohs. You also see all of the major trappings of Egyptian civilizations. You see the pharaoh's crown, pharaoh's 2 crowns, both the south and the north. You see the symbols of power and kingship, like the flail and the crook. You see the ritual boat, which we will meet in a few minutes, and even the ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs. Let me be clear about this. The hieroglyphs, or what you call the hieroglyphs, are not Egyptian. They would actually be called Kushite or Nubian or Sudanese. The hieroglyphs did not originate in Egypt, it originated in Nubia. All of these things we find in the Kingdom of Ta-Seti. The Ta-Seti Cemetery L is where the Egyptians came from, which we discussed earlier, who were the ancient Egyptians. So I recommend for you to see the video called Who Were the Ancient Egyptians. Here are some of the pictures from Cemetery L. You need to see some of these artifacts. And when you look at them, it will be very clear to you that these are African artifacts, that they did not come from any place else but Africa itself. Here is a jar for keeping grain or even liquid. Here are beads, and these beads were handcrafted. We have pottery, and this is very West African-like. When you look at the pottery, this is something that is strikingly similar to the type of pottery that you see in West Africa even to date. This, in my estimation, is the most important artifact. This is an incense burner. Okay, the incense burner has carvings on it, and the carvings are absolutely crucial to understanding the fact that Egyptian civilization came from this cemetery. Okay, now, as you're looking at the incense burner, because it's circular, you can't really see it. So this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to take the incense burner and I'm going to spread it out. Once I spread it out, then you'll be able to see what it really looks like. At the top, you can see how it would look from the computer. Then underneath, you can see a drawing of it. Okay? Now, what we're going to do is we're going to look at the incense burner and we're going to identify certain elements. Okay? Now, one of the first things you can see is the pharaoh. In the inscriptions that you're looking at on the incense burner, you can plainly see the white crown. That white crown will be the crown that the Egyptians will wear. You can also see that he is holding the flail and the crook. You can see 3 ritual boats. And then to the right, you can see what we call the false door. Now, I want to emphasize here, you are not looking at something that is Egyptian. You are looking at something that is actually Kushite. And not only do you see Egyptian elements, but we can say emphatically that Egyptian culture comes from this area. Then we finally come down to the First Dynasty of Egypt, in which a king who is also Sudanese comes up from the south, and he unites Egypt. And as he's uniting Egypt, he brings it into one centralized government. This pharaoh's name is Narmer. He's sometimes called Menes, and his name means electric catfish. He is the first pharaoh of unified Egypt. So we have taken you from Africa's earliest times with the mummy and Nubia Astrological Observatory, all the way till we finally get to the First Dynasty of Egypt. Now we've got 18 more dynasties to go in order to get to Moses. So once we get to the First Dynasty, we still have a long way to go. So from the First Dynasty, you start to see the first pyramid built by the multi-genius Imhotep. In the Third Dynasty, then you have the great pyramids of Giza. In the Fourth Dynasty, I'm a fan of the Buhan Fort during the Middle Kingdom, which is now underwater, by the way, because of the flooding of the Aswan Dam. And of course, last but not least, the Temple of Amun, or the Temple of Amen at Karnak. It is the place where Moses will do much of his upper division studies, if I can put it that way. The Temple of Karnak, named after Amen, will be a center, the center for Egyptian theology. In 2315, you have the first time in history that a text is inscribed in writing on the wall of the tomb of Unas. This text is vital because it tells us many things about what the Egyptians believed about life and death and how you could reach paradise. And it also talks about the one God, the God one. By the time we go through the 18 dynasties, we reach the 18th dynasty under Thutmose I. I want to call note here that this is Moses' dynasty, and Thutmose I is also named Moses. He had a son named Thutmose II, and he had another son called Thutmose III. They're all named Moses. So the Moses of the Bible is in good company. This is one of the reasons why we know this is his context. Moses will become the author of the first 5 books of the Bible. And all of this, when he sits down to write, this is what he knows. He is drawing on thousands of years of information and understanding and data and theology there and culture. There is so much that Moses is sitting down with so that he can actually write the first 5 books of the Bible. So what did Moses know? He knew about 2,454 years of knowledge that he drew on when he sat down to write.